when I was passing a place on the outskirts, I saw many trucks of soldiers, but they were surrounded by a lot of people, and they just couldn't get into the center of the city. And I hear that in other places of the city, the same thing happened. So it would be a little bit difficult for them to get into the city, but I think in the end, if they use force, they would get into the city.
And as a marshal for the students, what are your instructions?
Well, my task is to make sure that the hunger strikers are set apart from those outsiders and to make sure that they are safe. That's my duty.
Now, the hunger strike stopped, and now it has started again, and I believe you want it to grow. Am I correct?
Yeah.
To grow in which way?
If I had time, I'll go back and be a marshal again. That's my duty, because my classmates were there on hunger strike. That's my responsibility to join them. I'm part of them.
You told me a little earlier, when we were waiting to go on the air, that you thought there would be 200,000 hunger strikers now. Do you really think that's possible?
That's possible. I think maybe more than that. As soon as the students in the universities hear of the news, they are sure to come. And I really don't know how many of them would come. I'm sure over 500,000. That's possible. Because everybody's angry with what the government is doing.
Well, Mr. Zhang, I thank you for taking time away from your duties to come and talk to us. Zhang Hua in our bureau in Beijing, and Tiananmen Square is filling up again even as we were talking. And now the U.S. and China. President Bush said today that the demonstrations in China show a relentless desire for freedom in the communist world. The president said he never would have imagined such events were possible when he served as the U.S. ambassador to China in the early 1970s. Like the rest of us, the Bush administration is trying to figure out precisely what is going on. Here's ABC's John McWethy.
As it longest, fastest leaders
and their supporters reach for democracy. Tonight we've asked 3 influential American analysts of China to help us understand what's going on. They are Michael Lambton, president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, Michael Oxenberg from the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan, and Harry Harding, senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington. First question, beginning with you, Mr. Oxenberg. You've been studying China all your adult life. Did you ever think you would see what you've seen in the last few days?
I always try to remember that modern Chinese history has been tumultuous, that the unexpected has been the norm, but that students engaged in a hunger strike would threaten the very stability of China and of the regime, no.
Harry Harding in Washington, did you think you'd ever see this?
I didn't think that I would see a mass movement on this scale involving so many sectors of society, spreading to so many cities, and then just after the emergence of that, the leadership of China apparently thinking that it can repress that movement.
And Michael Lambton?
Well, I certainly didn't expect to see it take this form at this time, but I think Deng's strategy was fundamentally one of trying to separate economic reform from political reform. And I believed, and many people believe, that that's fundamentally impossible to do, and we're seeing the natural outcome of economic demands feeding political demand.
Do you have the vaguest idea of where this is leading?
I believe that it's too early to say what the results will be, but I do think that eventually the student demonstrations will be quieted, but after that, China will have entered a real new page in its history, and political reform will be front and center on the leader's agenda.
Professor Harding, are you equally convinced that the students will be quieted down?
I think it may be very difficult to bring the mass protests to an end. I agree with Mike Oxenberg that over the longer run, we can be optimistic that political reform will again be on the agenda, that is unavoidable. My concern is how much disorder, possibly violence and bloodshed is going to take before we get from here to there.
And the people in Beijing today have been, in the words of John Lawrence, laying their bodies down to prevent the army coming in. How loyal is the army to the party, Mr. Lambton?
Well, I think a very interesting thing happened. As I understand, the 38th Army was ordered in earlier to begin to quell the movement. The commander of the unit had a daughter in the square and refused to implement the order. I think I met with a Chinese person this morning who had a son in Tiananmen, and what you have potentially, because so many of the university students are the sons and daughters of high officials or middle-ranking bureaucrats, you have the party and the government potentially turning the forces of violence loose on its own children. Or middle-ranking bureaucrats, you have the party and the government potentially turning the forces of violence loose on its own children.
Professor Harding, do we know precisely after these many days what the students want exactly?
What they're really asking is that the Chinese Communist Party implement the political reforms that they have been promising their own people ever since the early 1980s.
Michael Oxenberg, a final thought from you.
As I think about the week and the coming week, I have to note the irony that Deng Xiaoping welcomed Mr. Gorbachev and thereby ensured China tranquil borders for the first time since the 1830s and the Opium War. It should have been a week of crowning success, and instead what he confronts is a major domestic crisis. So it's a moment full of irony and tragedy, and one can only watch and hope that both the leaders and the people can emerge after the coming week with their government stable and humanely treating their people.
Mr. Oxenberg, all three of you.
Tell the students to go back to class. In the meantime, the siege goes on, and every sunrise seems a victory for the young people in the square. Life is hard for them. Sleep is uneasy and crowded. The hands raised in victory V's sometimes droop. The students try to sweep up the garbage, but there is so much garbage. They wash, but there is so much dirt. Buses ring part of the square, a defense against attack, windows taped to limit the impact of flying glass. Flags flutter, and these big banners, which look like Viking sails. The people huddled outside the Great Hall of the People see each dawn as a victory. Another night passed, and we're still here. By day, helicopters drop leaflets. The Army doesn't want to suppress the students, but it must enforce martial law. That's not easy. People power intercepted this convoy. Troops got an earful from citizens. These guys are marching off to lunch, not war. In the rest of the city, things inched back towards normality Monday. Some buses ran, but the subway was closed, station doors locked. Gas stations open for the first time in several...
In Tiananmen Square, reporting for us live as Chinese soldiers started closing in and opening fire.
Now people are running away from the gunfire, from the advancing troops, assuming they are advancing. I guess they are.
Dick, that sounds very much like automatic weapons fire.
Yeah, but automatic weapons, but being fired essentially one shot at a time for the most part. We can see the troops now. There are, about 6 or 7 abreast. They're marching in columns of about 4. They're moving, from my vantage point at least. There are thousands of them, troops in extraordinary numbers. They're moving south to north along the western side of the square. They've got rifles on their shoulders. They're wearing helmets. They're in battle dress. And as they're advancing, there are people who are firing these, I guess, what we could call warning shots and flares into the square. They're marching at about double time now, in very close ranks. And my goodness, the ranks just go on for trying to peek around the corner and look for the size of a football field and a half at least, maybe 2 football fields.